This is We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you can live better. Monogamy in the West is our default relationship model. But to be clear, it is a social construct. It is not inherent to our biology. We don't exactly know when humans adopted monogamy as our dominant relationship construct, which means we're also not exactly clear why it emerged, but we have theories. The first theory is that monogamy evolved in humans to provoke greater paternal investment and care for offsprings. Human babies, as you well know, are high maintenance and remain dependent on caregivers for a very long time. Throughout evolution, having paternal involvement increased the likelihood that offspring would survive, and monogamy increased the likelihood that the baby's biological father would feel responsible for sticking around and providing that care. Another evolutionary theory, which is quite grim, is that monogamy originated from the threat of lethal violence towards babies. If a male from another community challenged a male, he might kill infants that he hadn't fathered. Mothers would then stop lactating, they would start ovulating, and that would give him an opportunity to father his own children through the widow or widows. So, to prevent infanticide and rape, a female might choose a male ally who could defend her and her babies. Anthropologists believe that this is the most likely origin of monogamy. I'm opening today's conversation by giving you the history of monogamy so you'll understand its origins and so you can weigh those reasons against the following stats pertaining to monogamy's success rate, at least here in the United States. The CDC reports that the U.S. divorce rate is somewhere between 40 and 50%, and that is for first marriages. For second marriages, it jumps to 60%, and for third marriages, it lands around 73%. The percentage of people having sex in long-term monogamous relationships, that's not much better either. Sexless relationships are relatively common, with estimates that 15 to 50% of couples in long-term monogamous relationships experience a lack of sexual activity. Which brings me to a question that today's guest has pondered quite deeply. Is it time to rethink monogamy as our relationship model? Why does the practice of having a consensual sexual relationship with multiple partners seem morally disparate? Isn't that better than having an affair, or getting divorced, or denying one of our most basic human needs and living in a sexless relationship? Here to discuss her journey of opening up her marriage is New York Times bestselling author of More, a Memoir of Open Marriage, Roden Winter. Molly, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You are a straight woman married to a man, and you opened your marriage up, consenting to him dating other women within the context of your marriage and you dating other men.
Yes.
Is that right?
That is correct.
How do you identify your relationship model?
Well, that's a question that I would have answered differently in 2008 when we opened our marriage. At that point, first of all, I wouldn't have told anybody, so I wouldn't have identified it at all. And second of all, I was really shying away from any labels that made it feel like we actually had made a decision, because it was very scary to do this. And so I conceived of it kind of as just this big experiment or an adventure, not like we were making this lifelong choice, because that was just too much to even contemplate. And I think for my own self, I think that was the way it needed to happen. If it's right or wrong, I don't know. But I think now I would say I have an open marriage, or I would say I'm polyamorous, because although 15 years ago, I really did not want to fall in love with anyone else, and I really did not want my husband to fall in love with anyone else. And so the idea of being polyamorous was not the goal. But then, spoiler alert, life happens, relationships happen, and my husband and I grew individually and together, and now we're in a place where we both have loving relationships outside our marriage, and we both, we love each other still and are having a great sex life with each other too. So it's not like we've just outsourced the things that we used to get from each other. We still are each other's primary partner. And there are folks who say, oh, hierarchical structures are not true polyamory. And that's, people are going to have their own things and it's fine to discuss it.
That's like the lesbians telling me that I'm not a real lesbian because I wear makeup and do my hair and wear skirts and high heels and I have a first name that has 2 syllables, not one. Do what makes you feel good.
Yeah, I think we do need to bust open a lot of these ideas. But so I do use the term non-monogamous also. Another thing that some folks say, just to get all of the the debate points out around the terminology, some people use the term ethical non-monogamy and then to differentiate it from cheating. And then people get upset that makes it sound like you're being morally superior, which can happen. I mean, people are people. People like to think that what they're doing is the right thing and often will then say what you're doing is the wrong thing. I don't believe that monogamy is wrong. I don't believe polyamory is right. I don't think one is necessarily more ethical than the other. And I certainly did not practice non-monogamy very ethically when I first opened my marriage. With my own husband, yes, but like in the larger society, was I doing some things that maybe I shouldn't have done? Yeah. So I'm not presenting myself as this like ethical model of anything. And I just wanted to tell my story in as real a way as I could because I didn't feel like there were any that I had read real people, especially mothers, talking about their own long-term experiences of being in an open marriage.
Why were you concerned about loving someone or your husband loving someone?
I think it's because when, you grow up in our culture as a Gen Xer in particular, what I saw all around me, and this is, spoiler alert, my parents had an open marriage but never told me. So what I saw everywhere was that if people got divorced because they fell in love with somebody else or they cheated and then they ran off with someone. And, these were the sagas happening not only on soap operas and in movies and in books, but also in the parents of my schoolmates, So to me, love meant loving one person was what people did. And if you loved more than one person, it meant your marriage was going to end. And I did love my husband. I do love my husband. So what I thought I wanted, and it changed, what I thought I wanted was some new sexual experiences. And also I wanted to escape from the roles of being a mother and a wife, which felt very constricting. I didn't know that's what I was looking for. And I didn't know that what I would ultimately really desire was connection, not only with other people, but with my own self, that I would have this kind of huge self-discovery that came out of just dipping my toe into something that was just for me. But, that's kind of why I had to tell the story of the first 10 years, because it went through so many different twists and turns as I navigated this journey.
So what was the catalyst that led you and your husband to even discuss opening up your marriage?
Yeah, I think there are maybe 2 catalysts. One before we got married and then one after we got married. And before we got married, my husband said to me when we were just talking about getting married, he said to me, there is no way you're going to be okay with only sleeping with me for the rest of your life. And I was like, that's ridiculous. And the reason he said that is because I was rather virginal. I was not a virgin, but I had been with very few people. I had had one college boyfriend for 4 years. I met my husband when I was 23 years old, and I didn't have much experience at all. He's 5 years older. He was all over the place. So he had a couple 1-year relationships, but by the time he was 28, he had been with a lot of people.
I love that at 28, it felt from the perspective of a 23-year-old like he was worldly. In hindsight,
yes.
In hindsight,
absolutely.
Does it still feel that way to you?
Well, I think the worldliness, I think that's why it's all about just like who you are in relation to your partner. He was way more worldly than I was at that time, and it would have been wildly inappropriate for, I think, somebody who was like old enough to be my dad to be schooling me in these things, although people would disagree with me on that. So yes, I think he was just worldly enough for me. He was worldly enough, but still, we were within range of each other, so we could still grow together. And he wasn't like trying to shape me or anything. But he felt like, wow, if I had only been with a few people, I don't think I would be cool with this. And so it was an idea that was planted and discussed. And he had told me, listen, if you want to sleep with someone else, just tell me, you know? And I was like, that's never going to happen. We did do some like sex club things and a couple threesomes, which I write about in the book before we got married. But once we got married and had kids, I was like, that is done, right? So that I thought was not going to ever happen again. And then the catalyst that begins more was in 2008. My kids were 6 and 3, and I was staying home from work for a year. And I say that probably incorrectly. I was, being a full-time mom as opposed to teaching as well as being a mom, because my youngest needed some therapies and had some developmental issues. And so I was really committing myself to my kids for that year and going nuts. And so there was one day when my husband came home late from work, which he often did. He runs his own company, writes music for television and movies, and there would be calls with LA that would sometimes start at 6 p.m. And you know what I mean? It was a very frequent thing, not his fault. And but I lost it. And I was like, I got to get out of here. The second he came home, I just bolted. Didn't remember my keys, I had my keys, no phone, no wallet. That's what I had. And I ended up, yeah. I mean, back in 2008, you didn't always have your phone.
I was going to say, right now, that's incomprehensible.
Yeah, right. I just thought I was going for a walk, so I just needed my keys, right? I wasn't going to do anything. I just was like cooling off, And I ran into a friend who took me to a bar, and I met a guy, and he was younger than I was, still is younger than I am. And we had a connection that I couldn't quite explain. But the most important thing is I felt desire and I felt desired. And I felt like a whole person that was not just a mom. And I had been so immersed in motherhood for 6 years because, my oldest was still in diapers when I got, when I had my second. And so it's like there was no break in the baby stage. And my youngest had some issues and didn't sleep. And I was really, it's hard. So something cracked open in me. And when I told my husband about it, he basically said, you should go for it. And then there's some other stories there. Like he was a little turned on by it. He was kind of interested in doing it too. There's more to it than that, but that was the catalyst for how it all began.
I feel like the media gets that wrong with you so often because you're so transparent and your story doesn't change. You have been on more podcasts, you have been interviewed. We're taping this in April of 2024. Your book came out when, in January?
January, yeah.
Came out in January. You started press for your book, I think, in December. I have done my research.
Thank you.
It's ironically, I research for my podcast as if I'm going to be live on CNN. I only know one way to do things, and it's to overdo everything. And so I've heard so many times how people have taken that, and it feels to me, and I don't know if it feels this way to you, but it feels to me like it's been slightly changed, the frame of that, the phrasing of that, as if to say that you were somehow influenced by the patriarchy or by your husband being patriarchal, like as if he had been grooming you or as if you were doing this for him.
Yeah.
I mean, I just rail against that instinctively because that's not been, I read your book.
Yeah.
I've heard your words. That's not what you're saying. And I just want to ask, is that what happened?
It is not what happened. However, I will say there were moments when I was, and I'm very transparent about that in the book too. Like I was in therapy through this process, and there was a moment when I was like, wait a minute, this was my idea, right? I did have moments when I was so not interested in, I didn't want Stuart to be with other people. And at the same time, I knew that was so unreasonable to ask for that freedom myself and to not give it to him. But sometimes we are unreasonable, and sometimes there are, these inner conflicts. And it was really important to me when I wrote the book to just lay that all bare. And so there's nuance there. And I think part of what happens in our society these days, and I appreciate you railing against it, but I think there's a lot of people who aren't very interested in nuance. And so it's like either I am extremely one way or extremely the other. I read another review where someone said, the story is not told through a modern feminist lens. And I'm like, I was born in 1972. Like I am not, you know what I mean? I am a product of Gen X, and we had Kool-Aid dumped over our heads about like what we were supposed to be and how we were supposed to behave. And I had my mother as my model, who also would not talk about being in an open marriage and had a lot of shame. And, we're told as mothers, we can't be sexual beings. So yeah, like I am not trying to pretend like I am something that has risen above our culture. I think I am representative of a lot of women's situations where it's true. In a heterosexual marriage, usually the women are staying home with kids and are doing the majority of the emotional work. And so my husband had more freedom than I did from the get-go. And that was something that made me really angry. And I wrote about that anger in the book. So it's interesting to me, and I have gotten upset at times, but I also I'm starting to understand what this is, that this really isn't about me. This is about part of the problem with our discourse right now is the lack of nuance. And so I try to articulate my position and the kind of, the gray areas in there. I've been married for almost 25 years, though, and the book has been out. My husband's been, completely supportive of my writing the book, and he sees the stuff about everybody saying he's manipulative. And it's like we've joked about it. He was like, God, I wish I knew that I had this power over you to do whatever I wanted. And, the truth is, if I had said no more, I don't want to do this anymore, we could have closed the marriage. Maybe the marriage would have ended. I don't know, but that's not what I wanted. What I wanted was to keep looking at myself. I was getting through these experiences really curious about myself. And there was a moment when I did realize, oh, I'm not doing this for my husband at all. I'm not doing this for our marriage. I'm doing this for me. And that means I might have to do it differently than he's doing it. And we've continued to evolve and stay in communication with each other as we've gone through this whole experience, because having individual freedom within a marriage means that you're going to end up in some uncharted territory.
For sure. And there's no rules about polyamory or opening up a relationship.
You got to negotiate it as you go. Yeah.
And certainly at the time that you did it, 2008, there were very few guideposts. And I also had a polyamorous relationship in my last marriage.
Okay.
My first marriage. This will be my last marriage.
My previous marriage. Right.
Correct. In the rehearsal of my marriage, I had a polyamorous relationship, and the imperative of communication and constantly negotiating and renegotiating, because you can't possibly anticipate all the scenarios you're going to wind up in or all the feelings that are going to get evoked in you.
Right. Yeah.
So how much talking did you do beforehand? And was it enough?
Oh, we did not talk. I mean, when we say beforehand, because I didn't think we were really doing it, I thought it was just this idea or this experiment or this, I didn't know what we were doing. And so there was nothing to talk about beyond my feelings about it. There's a scene in the book, which is entirely, all of these things are true, where I canceled my therapy appointment because I didn't want to look at what I was doing and why. I was afraid of what I was going to find inside myself, which was a lot of rage, a lot of insecurity, a lot of fear, all the things that we don't like to look at in ourselves. I just wanted to act. I just was feeling very impulsive, and I wanted to do things without, and I was like, I'll figure it out later or never. So it took me going through some things and feeling like, oh, I know I'm not doing this the way I want to be doing it, for me to go back into therapy. And then ultimately we went into couples therapy. But it's like, I think it's a very human thing that sometimes it's like we don't want to look at the hard stuff. And that's part of the reason why I don't recommend opening your marriage unless you've got, I mean, now knowing what we know, I was ignorant. Ignorance can be bliss. I don't know how blissful I was in those early years, but like I did not realize what I was getting myself into. But I am here to say to anybody who is thinking about it, like it is not an easy road. It requires so much communication. Unless your communication is really solid already, it's not going to suddenly make you communicative. Although I do feel like it did help my husband and me. It forced some conversations that we wouldn't have otherwise had.
Because the pain point became exacerbated, and pain is a great motivator. And when you're not testing the waters and trying different things in your relationship in an extreme way like this, it is very easy to avoid the hard conversation. Not very easy, but it is far more easy. And when you've got a pain point like that, there's no bypassing it. You've got a mirror and you've got a husband, and you have to have those conversations.
Yeah. And it's really hard. I mean, even while I was writing the book, I sometimes had to like lie down and cry because I was like reliving things. And that's another critique that's come up, like, well, if it was so, she was crying all the time, she's in agony, why was she doing this if it was so hard? But I find it interesting. We don't say that about other aspects of life. If somebody is doing, like, think of Glennon Doyle, we can do hard things. It's like, it's hard. And the reason to push through is when you're seeing like, I'm growing, I'm evolving, I feel a little different in my skin. What I didn't want to do was stay in a stagnant place that I was feeling myself to be in. I don't think it's healthy if I were to be the exact same person I was when I met my husband at 23. Or if as soon as I had kids, I was like, well, I guess my individual exploration is over. Now I have to devote myself 100% to motherhood.
And not go into a deep depression when they leave the nest.
Right. Yeah. Which then you've still got, mine left last year. I don't want to spend the next 40 years wishing they were home. That's not healthy for either of us, for me or for them. So yeah, it's an interesting thing when people balk at, or the fact that I was crying, like crying is so bad. I wrote an essay recently for my Substack about tears because I think they're really important. I think crying is super important. And just because you're crying doesn't mean you've made some horrible turn in your life. We need to experience the full range of human emotion.
Speaking of the full range of human emotion,
yes,
you mentioned just a few minutes ago that in your own therapy, you had been in couples counseling with your husband. So often clients find me and they disclose to me that they are interested in other relationship models, but that the therapists that they previously had gone to had frowned upon them, cautioned them against that, maybe shamed them. What were your experiences like? Did you specifically look for a therapist who might be ironically open?
What's funny is, the way it happens in the book is the way it really happened. My friend was worried about me and suggested this therapist that it was actually her husband had seen. And she had gone once with her husband. She was like, I really like him. I think you'll like him. And that was who I call Mitchell. I don't use his real name in the book, but he was fantastic. And I just feel like I lucked out. I don't know. And then he recommended the couples therapist for us. And so
I'm going to need both of those names when we get done with this conversation.
I think they're both retired.
Of course they are. Of course they are. That makes perfect sense.
They were older and wiser even then. And so now,
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
I've gotten more than one DM asking like, who is Mitchell and can I please get his number? Yeah, it's tough, but I think my feeling also with therapy is that like if a therapist tells you what to do at all, go get another therapist. Because I don't think, maybe there are different models out there, but for me personally, the idea of going to therapy is to better understand my own mind and my own choices and, to to know myself better, not to have a surrogate authority figure that tells me what to do. So my feeling would be, whether you're looking at non-monogamy or anything in life, I believe that a therapist should help you understand what it is you're looking for, what it is you want, and how you can get there in the healthiest way possible. But you can't just say, do this, don't do that, because it's not going to work. Then people just start lying to their therapists.
Or they rebel.
Yeah.
And there's different ways of phrasing advice. And
Yeah, sure.
One of my favorite disclaimers is like, do not substitute my values for yours. If
That's
you
great.
do this, I imagine a few outcomes. Here's how I see it unfolding. What do you think?
Right.
Do what you think is in your own best interest, because I'm going to look, I'm here to support my clients no matter what their choices are.
Right.
But I'm also hired to help them see around corners.
No, that's true. That's true.
And I do try to do that whenever possible, but that is not a normal way of providing therapy. A quiet, reflective dynamic is much more common, for sure.
Yeah.
To your point.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say my therapists were that quiet either, but it is about the way you frame it. So to your point about, therapists who shame or frown upon, I hope that will change as this enters the mainstream more, and that, even having some research around it and having some models. That was another thing that I felt was really important. Not that the way I did everything is such a model, but yeah. I do feel really proud of our marriage, and I feel good in my skin. And my story has the added gravitas of my parents having a marriage that's lasted almost 60 years, that was open for a long stretch. And I think if we don't talk about these possibilities and discuss what are the potential pitfalls, then people can't make the kind of informed decisions that we want to be able to make.
And you're certainly shining a light on this. And I'm grateful for that, because so often people do. I mean, when a client comes to me and says that their last therapist frowned upon the idea of having a three-way or, going to a sex club, that is imposing. I'm speaking to other therapists here now.
Yeah.
That is us imposing our values on another individual. And I think it's really, really important to be open and to be willing to discover things that we don't know as therapists. What I hear you saying is that you were not shamed. And I'm really glad to hear that.
Yes. And if I had been, maybe things would have happened differently, but I also had the benefit of having my mother as my confidant. And although I know she still has some embarrassment, maybe shame is still the right word for having an open marriage when she did, she was very encouraging of me having whatever experience I wanted to have, and not saying that you need to do this or don't do this. We didn't really talk about the nitty-gritty, intimate details, but we did talk about it from an emotional standpoint. And her feeling was always, as long as you and Stuart's my husband, as long as you and Stuart keep talking through this and love each other, it's going to be okay. She didn't have that oh no, danger. And I think that is so unusual. The idea that I felt attraction for another man and my friends couldn't handle hearing about it, and the only two people that could, besides my therapist, were my mother and my husband. And
it's unbelievable.
It's such a gift that I had both of them and their kind of unconditional support, and felt like no matter what I did, I was loved, and that I could count on their love regardless of how things went.
Are you comfortable talking a little bit about how you discovered your mom and dad had been in an open relationship?
Sure. I wrote about it, right?
Yeah.
My aunt told me when I was 28, she got a little tipsy. And then it was funny. This last Christmas, she was saying to me, she's like, oh God, now I'm going to be down in history as a blabbermouth. And I told her, though, just this past Christmas, I really thanked her. I was like, because we didn't talk about sex in my house. My parents were progressive, but not as parents.
That's so
they
interesting.
didn't feel comfortable. They still don't. I mean, my mom will ask me questions about my other partners. My dad still kind of doesn't want to hear about it. I mean, he doesn't want to hear about and you know, daughters and fathers, that's its own thing. My kids don't want to hear about my sex life either, and that's just fine. But I feel like I didn't talk to my mother when I got my period. I didn't go to my mother when I needed a bra. I like went to my best friend who was like way more developed than I was. So she gave me all her old bras and I never caught up. And then my sister helped me when I had my period, like that kind of thing. But
Wow.
we did not talk about anything related to sex and bodies and all of it. So it was really hard for me when my aunt described it as, you know, your mother had an affair. That's the way my aunt saw it. And so I waited another year before I got the guts to talk to my mom about it. And my first question for her was like, does dad know? Because the way my aunt described it, it was an affair. And my mom still uses the word affair. I think they use the word affair to mean any sexual relationship that's not inside marriage, whether it's condoned or not, because there's no language for it in their generation. I was like, does dad know? And she said it was your father's idea. And I was like, whoa. And I was like, that sounds a lot. You know, it was before I met the Matt character that was the catalyst at the beginning of More, but it was after I knew, you know, Stuart and I had gone to a couple sex clubs and had a couple threesomes, and he had told me that it would be okay for me to do this in the future. But I had that conversation with my mom 6 years before I met Matt and we opened our marriage. And then I started talking to my mom more. We did not talk about it for those 6 years. And so it was like over time that we kind of built this ability to talk, and it's made us so much closer. And we are, you know, I just saw her a couple weeks ago and she's in a wheelchair now. She has Parkinson's. And we always hide in the bathroom. That's where we have like our best conversations where we can be away from everybody. And she wants the whole scoop. She wants to know about everything, not like all the sex acts per se, but she wants to know how I'm feeling about this one and how things are going with Stuart and all of it. And she's remained a really valuable confidant to me.
Well, she sounds amazing. I mean, who
She
doesn't
is.
want a mom like that?
I know. She's pretty great.
What were your biggest fears going into it?
The biggest fear was that my marriage would end, that I would blow up my marriage. And then tied to that would be that I would mess up my kids, that I would screw them up irreparably.
Both of those things feel like very fair concerns.
Yeah, right. And talking to my mom about those concerns, though, she was always so like, oh, no, it's fine. You know, she wasn't even like, oh, yeah, that could happen. She was like, oh, no, Molly, that's not going to happen. You're fine. And it was so reassuring because she knew the way we were doing it, too, that I was in therapy, that we were in therapy together. She was, you know, that we were talking. The feelings that I was having, she was like, oh, yes, I remember those days. I remember feeling that way. And there was something about just her being on the other side of it, too. And the fact that she still had these lovely friendships with men that she had been intimate with, and that I could see how devoted she and my father still are to each other. All of that just helped me see it as like, okay, this is hard, but I think it's going to be worth it. And my feeling now is it absolutely is. And I love my life and I love my marriage and I feel very grateful for it, which is partly why I wanted to write my story, because it was really hard and now it's really good. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to do it the hard way or do it at all. But I wanted to share my story as like what's possible.
I love that. What were the hardest parts?
The hardest parts for me, and they continue to be actually in an interesting way, but you know, getting easier every day. I still have a hard time being alone, but that could be whether Stuart is, it almost doesn't matter to me anymore if he's out with someone else or on a business trip. Like those things are like equal in my mind now. I'm better than I ever
Meaning
was
that you're
before.
lonely. You feel the loneliness. It's not about what he's doing when he's apart from you.
Yes.
There's a loneliness.
Yes. And meditation, I started meditating at the end of 2018. That has been hugely helpful. And other things like playing guitar, just looking inward more and more, which started with therapy. All of the looking inward has been so helpful. But it's interesting because what's hardest is the looking inward that this all prompted. But if I hadn't done that, things would be hard in another way. I think I would be repressed and stagnated and maybe grappling with the migraines, and it would show up in some other way. There are things that we all, I think, as humans need to attend to within ourselves. And if we don't attend to them, it's going to show up somehow. And at least this way, I do feel like I tend to it very consciously. It's also been hard at times. Was your question what's hard now, or what was the hardest part?
I'll take either.
Okay, because it's not like that's kind of the only thing that's hard right now. And that's more of a personal thing, a personality thing, I think, for me. What was the hardest at the time was my fear of loneliness. You know what I mean? I don't feel the fear anymore. I felt afraid of what would happen if I fell in love and wanted to leave Stuart, or if Stuart fell in love and wanted to leave me. And that fear doesn't exist at all anymore because it's happened. So like I have loved many people since the book ends. I think I love much more freely now in a way that is wonderful because I can, it's kind of a joke now, like I can fall in love with somebody whether they love me back or not. And I can be very free about it because it's like, oh, I'm fine. Like you don't have to love me, but just so you know, I love you. Not like everybody I meet, but it's happened before. And not everybody's in a place, and I don't always say it right away because it's creepy to some people, but I
do try to employ a little impulse control and have a little game.
Like,
I'm not trying to repel people.
Right. But it's also like I can love people as friends. I think my love is just open, and I feel very loving in my life. And it used to be a source of real fear for me. Now, though, Stuart has loved other people, continues to love the girlfriend that he meets at the end of More. They've now been together 9 years.
Wow.
So that relationship has stayed, but like nothing has ever really threatened our marriage in any, there's ever really been a breach. There have been really tough moments, which I write about, but we've always found our way back to each other in a stronger way, in a clearer way. And I think we both are so grateful to the other for the freedom that we allow one another. I can't imagine a scenario in which we wouldn't just keep choosing each other as our primary partners.
That's the interesting thing that happens when you have an open marriage. You get to choose to stay in your marriage or your primary relationship. You get to choose that again and again and again. It's not out of necessity, and it's not out of
default.
An absence. Right. It's not out of an absence of other options.
Right.
I mean, of course, people have other options, but when you're not consistently exploring other options, there's something to be said about like really appreciating the person you're with through having other experiences.
It's the choosing each other and valuing what we give each other and who the other person is. And it's the realization and the freedom that like, oh, if you're not going to be my person for this one thing, I can go do that with someone else. I don't have to give that up because you don't want to do it. And so there is such a lovely aspect of that. So I feel like we are both our fullest, happiest, freest selves, and we choose each other. And so that's all wonderful. But there was a time when I was afraid. I was afraid of what would happen. And I don't know that there's a way around that fear other than time. And I think that's a different course for every person. And even within a couple, I think Stuart felt way more secure with what we had before I did. I think he has always been more secure in himself than I have been. And I wonder also how much of it is, like I used to fear him being with younger women because, again, we've been fed this story that women have a shelf life and men don't. In my experience, like one of my partners now is 9 years younger than I am. And it's fantastic, And
you go, Molly.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. It's great. I don't feel my libido is as great as ever. I don't feel that shelf life anymore. I'm starting to value who I am at 51 and realizing, oh, me at 21 versus 31 versus 41 versus 51, I have become an increasingly great catch, in my opinion. So, like, I wouldn't have wished my 21-year-old self on like anybody. You know what I mean? I was
And
just like,
I think in all honesty, most of us, if we really examined ourselves reflectively,
yeah,
we also wouldn't.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And, my partner who's 42, if he wants to go date someone else, great. You know what I mean? It's like, that's all fine.
And he gets to choose you if he wants to
Yeah,
stay in this relationship.
yeah. And my husband too. So I feel like all of those fears have dissipated largely because of time and experience. You can't talk yourself out of some of these fears. You have to go through it and see what happens. And yes, some of my relationships that I thought were going to last didn't, and there was heartbreak, and that was hard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting a little more resilient than I used to be, partly because I'm also like, well, I'm going to love you forever. We might need to end this, but I don't see any reason to stop loving you. And so that's kind of the way I operate now. Like, once I love you, I love you. And so we're going to be friends at least for a long time. And that's kind of a great way to feel, because I don't feel the concern anymore about like, oh no, what's going to happen if. I'm like, oh, they might move, something might happen, but I'm so glad to have met this person and to have invited them into my life.
Speaking of love,
Yeah.
are you surprised by how worried you were that loving another person or other people, either you or Stuart, could compromise your love for each other?
I mean, now it feels crazy. However, I don't judge anybody for feeling it because I remember that feeling so well.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked about this in the book too. I remember the feeling the night before my younger son was born. I was getting induced, and I had to like say goodbye to my older son in his crib. I was like heading to I'd put him to bed, and then I was weeping over his crib because I felt like I was going to cheat on him with another baby. You know what I mean? I was like,
That is such a great, that's a great
I
analogy.
I just felt like, how am I possibly, because I loved him with my whole heart. It's like, how am I going to I'm either going to fall in love with this other baby and then you're going to be screwed, or I won't be able to love this new baby as much as I love you. And oh no, what am I going to do? And then boom, my heart doubled, expanded, tripled exponentially. Of course, I love them both. And I love that they have each other in their lives. Now they're 19 and 22. They're so different from one another, so delightful, each in their own way. And because they're also so different too, it's not like life without the one and life without the, I don't want to live without either of them in my life. And that's the analogy I can bring now to my marriage. Like, oh, I love Stuart so much. And I have two current partners that I love, love, love. And I have partners that I've had in the past that I still love that I don't see very often at all.
Right. The scarcity mentality that there's a finite amount of love in each of us, and that if we were to love another person, it takes away from the person we're either married to or our primary partner. If this conversation does nothing but this, I want to blow through that myth.
Yeah.
Love is not a finite resource. It's
Absolutely.
infinite. And just like a mother can love multiple children, which is the analogy you drew, so can a human being love multiple people. Does that mean open marriage is for everyone? Certainly not, and certainly not for the faint-hearted. I mean, my clients sometimes talk about opening up their relationships as a relationship pick-me-up, which always fills me with dread. In much the same way that like a lot of the straight guys that I work with whose girlfriends really want a long-term commitment, they want to up the commitment of the relationship, get to the next milestone. They're like, maybe I should just move in with her and that'll do it.
Yeah.
That's not a solve. That is not a solve any more than an engagement ring is a solve, any more than a baby is a solve.
Right.
What think you, Molly, about the idea of opening up one's relationship as a relationship like fuel injector?
Yeah, I would not recommend it in exactly the same ways that you just said. And at the same time, what's interesting is like I've been thinking about this, not because this is actually coming up with my kids, but like, my oldest who's 22 and is in a relationship. I also feel like I could never say to him, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, which is exactly your impulse as a parent. What I would say to him is your first obligation is to yourself. Because underneath all that wanting to up the relationship ante is this desire to hold on to a person. And behind that is often that person is going to make me happy, or this person makes me happy. And if you can't be happy anyway, this person is never going to make you happy. That was probably my biggest learning. And it's something I still, as I told you, struggle with. But now I know it's my own responsibility. Often I am very extroverted, so I can really use people as a distraction from something going on inside myself. I'm like, oh, let's go do this. Let's go do that. Let's go do this. And then now that I meditate, though, I know it's coming. I know I'm going to spend half an hour twice a day, and I'm just going to I'm going to feel the feels. So
Are you
I might as well just...
You're doing TM?
I am. And now I've learned all 4 advanced techniques. So I'm up to a half hour. But
Nice.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I look forward to it. So yeah, I think whenever we outsource our happiness and we can do that and we can try to glom onto somebody else as our happiness source, we're barking up the wrong tree. So it can look lots of different ways for different people. And I think just being able to recognize that, like, oh, and I still do it. Oh, I'm doing it again. I'm like being like, oh, but I want to be with you. And I do that with my friends too sometimes. I'm like, oh no, you're gonna go away for the summer. What am I gonna do without you? It's like I'm like that. I'm that kind of person. I kind of envy both Stuart and my older son in particular are very introverted. My oldest in particular, and I so envy him. I'm like, oh, he just wants to be alone. And he's like, he loves, he has friends, he has a girlfriend, he's got a full life, but it's also like when he can just be alone, he's so psyched. And like, I want to feel that way. And but I am who I am. And so I'm like, but I have such a more complete arsenal within myself than I used to of resources and pathways to finding, and also just getting a lot more comfortable with some of the negative feelings. Like I can cry and it's okay. I don't have to be happy all the time. That's another problem with our culture, thinking that you have to be happy all the time. So all those things, that was kind of going off on a tangent, but I basically agree with you. Do not open your marriage as a way to solve a problem.
Sex aside, how does having an open relationship serve you?
I think it's just more sources of love. My husband and the 2 partners I have right now are all delighted that there is a trio on the
diversifying my needs being met.
Yeah. No, because it's also like they're also all 3 like independent, well-rounded, like solid people, which is who I like to be in relationship with. But like I get to do different things with each of them, and they have different sensibilities and different ways of conversing. So I love talking to all 3 of them, and we talk about different things usually. Like occasionally I'll see an article or something and I'll be like, oh, I need to send this to, I don't know why I'm trying not to say names, but I just like, I haven't gotten permission from one of my partners to just use his name in podcasts. So I'm just going to not use names. I can use Stuart and this partner, or both my other partners, but not Stuart, or sometimes all 3 of them, or sometimes, just Jason, who I do have permission to use his name. But it's like, it's all different. I can have like, I was just thinking about blank, and it'll go a different direction with each of them, just like having different friends. You know what I mean? That's the other way to think about it. It's like, I wouldn't want to have just one friend. Maybe there are people in this world who, and people who prefer monogamy, they don't want to necessarily invest the time and energy in relationships with multiple people. For some people, that sounds exhausting, and that's fair.
It is for an introvert. Yeah.
And that's also why sometimes I think monopoly works when one person in the relationship is very introverted and the other person is extroverted. And I've talked to friends of mine who have explored that and felt guilty, like, especially, I have a female friend whose partner is encouraging her to see other people because he doesn't want to do all the things she wants to do, and he has less of a sex drive. And it's like, and she feels so guilty. And I'm like, you don't understand the relief this is going to bring him.
100%.
Because like 100%. He wants you to be happy, and that he doesn't have to do the things he doesn't want to do. He can just be your person that you come home to and snuggle and watch Netflix and have sex once in a while. But you can go have this life that you want with other partners, and he doesn't have to feel like he's holding you back. So
and just to clarify, by monopoly, we're talking about within a committed relationship, only one of those partners is going to date or be with other people.
Right. Right. Yes. And sometimes people think that's, some act of manipulation. I can see that working. When I first got into this world, one of the people I dated, it was that situation. His wife was not seeing others and he was, and that made me feel really uncomfortable. But now that because I didn't understand it, I thought I was going to the default setting that so many other people do, like, oh, he must have, I was doing the thing that other people have done to me, like, oh, he must have manipulated her or whatever. So that's partly why I can't say shame on you to other people, because I've had all the thoughts. We've all had some of the thoughts at some point, and we can learn and grow and change and realize, oh, that's not what was happening. And maybe in one case it would be, and in another case it's not what's happening. We don't know. But I can see it now as a really valid model when people want to be. And then some folks will say, well, why don't you just get divorced? Because sometimes you really want to build a life with this person, and there's so many reasons.
Sex is so little in a relationship. It is such a small component of what makes a relationship work when you cohabitate with your partner. Even if you don't. Speaking of which, can you ever see a day where you do invite another partner to live with you and Stuart, or when he does?
Oh my God. We don't even really like house guests. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm a terrible host. I don't know. I feel like that would get difficult. I don't want to put that on her. Like, that's not her job to cook for me.
I totally get it.
But I do like that both my partners now outside of Stuart do cook, and that's lovely.
Good. They keep you fed. How would you advise someone who wants to have a conversation with their partner about opening up their relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. For one, I feel so glad that people who want to do that now have so many resources, including podcasts such as yours, including books such as mine. There's just a lot more out there where you can just say, oh, I came across this thing. Like, would you be interested in listening to it with me? And it's just like got me thinking about some things. You know what I mean? And my feeling is, if you're in a relationship where you can't even talk about something that's on your mind, there's a problem there, right? And so maybe you have to dip your toe carefully. Maybe you even have to have the cap, because it takes time for people sometimes to wrap their head around something like this. And your reasons for being interested might vary. But I think it's fair to have a little prologue scripted that you think will be the truest thing you can say, that is also the least hurtful thing you can say. So I think it's worth spending some time. My two big things when I'm talking to anybody now are like, I want it to be true, and if possible, I want it to be kind. We can't always control how it's going to be received, but I think making an effort to kind of plan what you're going to say in a way that is both true and kind, not in a way that's, you don't want, obviously the opposite of truth is lying, but like withholding some parts of what you want to say, I think is okay, as long as whatever you are saying is true. That's kind of my rule of thumb. You don't have to say every single thing you're thinking and feeling right away, because that can feel unkind.
It can also flood the recipient and be overwhelming and too much.
Yes, absolutely. So go with a true and kind prologue. Maybe have some outside resource in mind that you want to
Like
share
this
with them,
podcast.
like this podcast, and make a time for the conversation around it that's not going to be a hectic, stressful time. And know that it's going to take probably a lot of conversations. And that my other piece of advice is the person who is least enthusiastic sets the pace.
Yep. Can I just draw the weirdest analogy?
Sure.
A year and a half ago, one of my cats went to heaven. The uh the grieving cat stopped eating, and I was
Aw.
like, fuck, I gotta get another cat. I got her a kitten. Listen, I'm a therapist married to another therapist. We cycled through 4 cat shrinks to integrate these cats. It took a year and a quarter because apparently I ruptured the surviving cat's grief. I ruptured her mourning process.
Oh no.
But what I'll tell you is the common denominator of all of those cat shrinks was this: you have to go at the slowest cat's pace.
Yeah.
You have to go at the shyest cat's pace, and she sets the pace. So to your point, 4 very well-respected cat shrinks agree with you that when it comes to relationships, you move at the slowest person's pace.
Yes. Yes. And that's how you respect each other. If it turns out that that pace is too glacial for you to remain in your primary relationship, then that will come out in the wash, and that will be something you'll have to discuss. But to have that intention and to try not to rush the other person, yeah, and it's there are going to have to be some compromises along the way, or it might be a situation where this relationship is not going to survive because one person feels that they can only evolve and grow in the way they want to in life, in a way that is counteractive to how the other person wants to grow and change in their life. Like for me, that's what it's all about. Can you grow as individuals within this partnership? And if you can't, I don't think that's a good partnership. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you don't love each other. It doesn't mean that you failed. That's my feeling about it.
It's very similar to me to the way teenagers need to be individuals within the
Yeah.
family, and they begin pushing back on the family talking points and begin creating their own values and principles and
Yeah.
opinions and needs and wants and ways of expressing their unique individuality, because we all have this inherent need, desire, and right to be
Yeah.
loved within the relationship that we're in, and that will happen in long-term relationships. The same thing has to happen. We want to be, once we feel safe enough, we then want to be able to be individuals within the relationship. And if the relationship itself is one that fosters growth and individuality, you guys have a really good chance of growing together.
And I would add to that, just kind of along the lines of the previous thing we were talking about, I'd say for the person, often I think people whose partner comes to them saying like, "Oh, I'm interested in talking about non-monogamy." It can feel like a blow. It can feel like, "Oh my God, I'm not enough. This isn't working." I would say another way to look at it, and this is kind of also with parenting, like when my kids would rail at me and scream at me, my mother would say, "That's because you're safe." You know what I mean?
100%. I'm here to certify that.
Yeah, you are safe with me, and so you're gonna bring all of your anger and angst to me. And similarly, if your partner is coming to you and saying, "Can we talk about this?" That's a testament to the strength of their relationship and their feeling of safety with you. So I think you can take it as a compliment. I think it's hard, just like it's hard when your teenager is screaming at you. Um, but I think there is a parallel there, and it doesn't mean that the relationship is terrible. It might mean that there is something really strong here.
Sage advice. Molly Winter, where can people find you and follow you?
Yeah, my website is a great one-stop shop for my Substack and my socials. So that's mollyrodenwinter.com. And I'm most active on Instagram, which is at Molly R. Winter.
Beautiful. Molly, thank you so much for this conversation. I loved it, and we're going to have coffee soon.
Yes, please, please, please. Thank you so much.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. This episode was produced by me, Darcy Sterling. Editing and sound engineering by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani, Preston Smith, and Stephanie Sterling. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing about today's topic, please share this episode with them. If you have a question or comment, email us at darcy@askdrdarcy.com. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the relationship, dating, and mental health hacks that you've come to expect. As always, references are linked in the show notes.